People's perception of laziness is not only misled, but it's twisted and backwards. And the way we conceptualize laziness has an impact on our own productivity, how we get things done, and how we feel about ourselves. I think this whole concept relates to decluttering, minimalism, and broader life issues that I'll discuss later. But first, I want to talk about the basics of how dangerous and damaging this concept of laziness can really be. I would argue that laziness does not actually exist, but it's this blanket term we've decided to use for this group of behaviors, for something that's going on that we don't understand, or even for a total misperception of the situation. We talk about it like it's this characteristic some people have, but usually if people aren't doing something, it's because there's a reason for it. Quite often for perfectionists, this looks like a fear of failure or even a fear of having imperfect work that will affect other people's perception of them. Or they're afraid of the challenge that the task will give them. There are aspects of the experience of doing the task that they're terrified of. Quite often, procrastination isn't about just needing to get more motivation. It's about the avoidance that we're experiencing because of a genuine fear we have or anxiety about the future. And so that's a real psychological process that's going on that's leading people to put things off when it's not necessarily just because they're lazy or they're not hard workers. Another common reason why I think people are perceived as lazy is that they don't have the tools to help them initiate action or to structure their plan for really complex problems. I have a lot more to say about this topic, so please stick with me. But for those of you who fall into this category, those who don't feel like they have the tools to make things more manageable, I want to share with you today's sponsor, Skrintl. Skrintl is a visual knowledge management tool. It was created by a group of people in Stockholm, which I think is reflected in its no-nonsense, minimalist aesthetic design. It can be super helpful for a variety of types of jobs for researchers, advanced students, writers, creators, or really anyone tackling complex topics. I like that it helps me give structure to ideas or projects that are more abstract or hard to pin down, which as a creator and a freelancer is so important for me. They're basically these boards or sets of boards that you can add color-coded cards to organize principles. You can organize the cards via tags. I also tend to color coordinate categories and spatially arrange cards in a way that makes sense to me. It's also super easy to use, and I think it's way easier than a lot of these other kind of organization apps that I see or hear a lot more about. This one is just extremely user-friendly. So basically, here's an example of a to-do board for me. I like that I can simplify with just the titles on the card so that there aren't too many words on the page, and then I can click in and see more specifics. I can create to-do lists and check them off as I complete them. I can have different categories and color codes. So I have blue for my podcasting jobs, pink for fun things like planning for visits with friends that are coming to visit. And then I also have a video ideas list that I keep running all the time, along with the video plans and outlines. So for example, for this video, I have this outline that has all the information I need for when I record. This tool really keeps me on track. It gets my ideas down on paper virtually. It's less visually overwhelming, and it makes my work honestly more fun. If you're interested in trying Skrintl out, check out the link at the top of my description box and use the code SLICEOFLIGHT10 for 10% off. I've seen Skrintl as a game changer for me, so I highly recommend it. Anyway, as I was saying, I feel like laziness is this misnomer that we use to label things that we really just don't understand. For example, someone you might perceive as lazy might simply have different priorities from what you have. Just because their priorities aren't your priorities doesn't make them lazy. And sometimes the actions people take don't necessarily look like a priority because maybe they're engaging something that's enjoyable or fun for them, but maybe it is actually a values-based action like spending time with family or friends, or even just relaxing and decompressing a bit. It might also just be a matter of having way too much on your plate and being overwhelmed. If you have a million things to do, you can't do everything in a day, and sometimes you have to get certain things done and you don't get other things done. But because of this concept of laziness, we can label the things that we just didn't quite get to as a symptom of laziness generally, And that can be really detrimental because then we can start to see ourselves as lazy people, and that can start to get in the way of our own productivity, our own confidence, and how we feel about ourselves. I also want to bring up the issue that the use of the term laziness is often a reflection of a really messed up bias people have against people experiencing a disability. A person who is at rest may need to be resting for real reasons. Maybe they're dealing with a medical problem, a physical disability, or even some kind of mental disability. And sometimes, even if there isn't a known medical problem or source of the issue, there could actually be one there that just hasn't been diagnosed yet. I think about the fact that looking back and knowing my symptoms, I probably had MS for about at least 10 years before I got diagnosed. And it is true that I was mostly able to function, and it wasn't until the really serious flare and a huge increase in the severity of my symptoms that I did get diagnosed. But I just think about all the people out there walking around who might not even be diagnosed with something yet, but who have real challenges they face day to day. I think this can be a real struggle for people with both visual and invisible disabilities, where something that they're dealing with physically forces them to rest, to need to take breaks, forces them to say no to certain things, and then people judge them for it. And so there's also this balance about explaining why to people, or just kind of not explaining why because you don't want to overly bring it up all the time. That's something I'm still kind of figuring out for myself. Another common problematic mislabeling of the word laziness is its use in the context of what's actually weight bias and fat phobia. A lot of people characterize people who are, quote, overweight as being lazy, and this is supported by a lot of research. And there's research to show that the internalization of these biases can really lead to problems for people. It is wild to me how much, even to this day, fat phobia and weight bias is so socially accepted in the media and socially. I just recently watched that new movie Wonka with Timothée Chalamet, and I was so disappointed in that they essentially had this crooked cop who decided to eat a bunch of chocolate and put on weight, and he was kind of working with the bad guys in the story, and they made a whole kind of joke around how he had gained so much weight. And it just shocked me that in this day and age, people are still just like associating these negative constructs with being, quote, overweight or larger in some way. And it's sad that people just accept fat phobia as funny still. And I think the reason why it upsets me is that it can lead to a lot of problems. It can lead to psychological self-blame, depression, anxiety, and also it can lead to eating disorders. And as someone who spent a lot of her time working in researching eating disorders, weight bias, weight loss, all those topics, that's basically what I used to research when I was getting my PhD in clinical psychology. I think one of the biggest takeaways I got from that research was that a lot of your weight is just simply not in your control. It's things like the hormones that tell you when to eat or how much to eat, that affect your appetite and even how you metabolize food. It's about genetics and epigenetics. It's those things in combination with social norms and access to food and socioeconomic factors and financial limitations. It also can be linked with medical conditions or medications that people are using. And I do want to add, I'm not saying that we shouldn't try to eat healthfully, that we shouldn't try to make good decisions for our own health. Of course we should. But I do think we should be aware of how this stigma and how we can mislabel people as lazy can contribute to incredible pain and suffering for people. But I think what's important to realize is that this kind of stigma can lead to even self-stigma, where someone is telling themselves for whatever reason that if other people perceive me as lazy, well then maybe I am. And that can be really psychologically detrimental and hurtful and dangerous. And if you notice yourself starting to blame yourself or label yourself as lazy, I think it's maybe a sign that you should take a look at why. Is it some kind of social stigma or bias that you're leaning on to make that evaluation of yourself? And is that just plain inaccurate? Is it some kind of symptom also of perfectionism? And are you simply labeling yourself that because you have too much going on? You're overwhelmed and you can't get everything done and you can't possibly be productive at every single moment of the day. Or maybe you need to perceive your restful time or your battery recharge time as productive activities as well, because it is important that we have fun. It is important that we relax. And we're not built to be hyper productive all the time. Eventually, we will burn out. So when it comes to anything, whether it's getting the motivation to declutter and to minimize, or whether it's to pursue some kind of interest or dream or goal, we need to sit down and be our own analyzers, our own scientists of our own lives. What is it that's a barrier for me? Is this really laziness, or is something going on here for me? Is it an unfair bias that just isn't accurate? Or is there some other thing going on, like I have another priority or I have too much on my plate? I think a great example of this is back in the day when I was in grad school, I had a lot of different roles. I was a therapist for 2 to 3 days a week, giving therapy to people. I did research. I also often, had my bigger project going on, either my master's thesis and then my dissertation. In addition to like a bunch of different research I was working on, I also had classes I was taking. I also ended up teaching classes. So my point is that I had a lot going on, and quite often the stuff that had to get done every week, like seeing patients and writing notes for those patients, would take top priority. And that was important, if I'm actually seeing a patient, that needs to be a priority. But quite often the longer term projects would get kind of pushed to the wayside. And so I got a lot better at sitting down and evaluating, how do I want to use my time this week? What's actually my priority here? Because quite often that research was what interested me the most and what I wanted to spend more time on. So I would do things like, maybe I just won't put quite as much effort into this project or a paper for a class, and focus more of my time on that longer term goal. And I think quite often, if we take the time to evaluate what's going on, why we're not getting something done, there is a very good reason. In that case, I had so many different roles and hats I was wearing. And it was once I sat down and evaluated, how am I spending my time and what do I actually care about? What do I want to prioritize? That I was able to navigate that situation a bit better. I think this is an important topic that I've been thinking a lot about, and how it plays out in our lives, how we see other people, how we see ourselves, and it's important to question those assumptions we make. Laziness is this misnomer, this blanket term for something that is usually a symptom of a much more specific issue. Anyway, don't forget, if you're interested in trying out Scrintl, check out the link in my description box. I absolutely love this tool, and it definitely helps me be more productive. I'd love to hear your reactions to all this. Thank you so much for spending this little bit of time with me, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.